The opening chapter of our 12-part chronicle of doom eternal ignites in the shattered atmosphere of a dying Earth, serving as the biological funeral for a civilization consumed by the hellbound invasion. The lore of this era is the lore of the unholy consumption. Its purpose was the systemic extraction of human essence for Argent Energy. The history of Earth's fall is the history of the Deeg Council, 3 hell priests who betrayed the mortal realm by orchestrating a transdimensional gateway that converted human suffering into divine fuel. This is the tragedy of the Maker ambition, proving that the Sentinels' heaven was not a paradise, but a parasitic engine that willingly traded the souls of the many for the immortality of the few. The lore of the Khan Maker provides the theological foundation for this planetary collapse. As the supreme ruler of Urdak, the Khan Maker faced a biological stagnation where her race could no longer resurrect or perpetuate their essence. The lore suggests that Urdak is a sanctified parasite. Its purpose was the maintenance of the Maker life cycle through Argent Energy. By partnering with the dark realm of hell, the Khan Maker developed the technology to synthesize a new power born from the friction between Sentinels and demons. This reveals the mercenary purpose of the fall. Heaven and hell are business partners in the industry of agony. The rise of the hell on earth was the final solution for the Maker's decay, proving that divinity is often a mask worn by the desperate to justify the unthinkable. The physical environment of the hell on earth provides insight into the atmospheric despair of the fall. Massive supergore nests and hell growth have mutilated the skyline of New York and Los Angeles, turning the cradle of humanity into a breeding ground for the legions of the damned. The lore of the demonic consumption explains that its purpose was the terraforming of the mortal realm into an extension of hell. As the demons harvested the inhabitants, the reality of the earth began to thin, allowing the dark realm to bleed through the cracks. This reveals the geographical purpose of the invasion. It was not a raid, but a hostile takeover. This was the era of the Gore Nest. This shows that the history of the earth is a history of the soil, which was saturated with ichor to feed the hunger of the abyss. The relationship between the Doomslayer and the Fortress of Doom represents the technological vengeance within the fall. Operating from a satellite stronghold of Sentinel origin, the Unchained Predator tracks the Hell Priests to sever the connection between worlds. The lore suggests that the fortress is a sacred relic. Its purpose was the coordination of the one-man war. Unlike the UAC technology of the past, the fortress combines Sentinel magic with Maker circuitry, allowing the Slayer to bypass demonic shields and strike with precision. This reveals the surgical purpose of the return. The Slayer is the scalpel that cuts the tether of the Hell Priests. This was the era of the Sentinel Knight. The history of the fortress is the history of the Bastion, which hovers in the void to protect the flicker of humanity. Furthermore, the lore of the Deeg priests, Rannoch, Grav, and Nilox, represents the administrative cruelty of the fall. These corrupted Sentinel lords serve as the anchors for the demonic signal. The lore suggests that treason is the deepest sin. Their purpose was the management of the human slaughterhouse. By stationing themselves in fortified cathedrals across the earth, they ensured that the soul harvest met the quotas set by the Khan Maker. This reveals the bureaucratic purpose of the priest's office. They are the accountants of death. This was the era of the unholy triumvirate. This shows that the history of the priests is a history of the betrayal, where the shepherd sold the flock to the wolf for a seat at the Maker's table. The relationship between Vega and the Sentinel navigation represents the artificial divinity within the fall. The AI entity resurrected by the Slayer functions as the brain of the fortress. The lore suggests that Vega is more than software. Its purpose was the computation of the multiversal portals. By interpreting the Maker code, Vega locates the Hell Priests, even when they hide in subdimensional pockets. This reveals the informational purpose of the Slayer's success. Information is the only weapon that hell cannot corrupt. This was the era of the ghost in the machine. This shows that the history of Vega is a history of the compass, which points the Slayer through the fog of war. The lore of the Argent Energy cycle represents the metabolic atrocity of the fall. It is revealed that Argent Energy is not a natural resource, but the end product of human souls being tortured until they fracture. The lore suggests that energy is scream-based. Its purpose was the powering of the celestial machines. By refining the residue of the soul, the alchemists of hell created a fuel that violates the laws of thermodynamics. This reveals the vampiric purpose of the cosmic economy. The universe is burning sentience to keep the lights on in heaven. This was the era of the soul fire. The history of Argent is the history of the crime, which stains the hands of the gods with the ash of the innocent. The act concludes with the first decapitation as the Doomslayer executes Deeg Nylox, sending a shockwave through the demonic hierarchy. The purpose of the return to Earth was to be the universal exposure of the Maker's collusion. It shows that prophecy is a wall that the Slayer smashes with a super shotgun. The Slayer realizes that the Council is frightened by his presence. The rise of the Slayer's vengeance is the final movement of the primeval lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, hope is not a feeling, it is a weapon that is loaded with rage and fired at the face of the gods. The legacy of the first kill in this chapter is the horror of the broken pact. We realize that peace was a transaction and survival was a tax that the Khan Maker levied against the mortal. The purpose of the workshop of the Sentinel was to guard the realms, and the fall was the commercialization of the agony. As the Slayer walks through the blood-soaked corridors and tightens his grip on the Praetor suit, hearing the wails of the demons blending with the heavy metal of his pulse. They understand that the history of the Doom is the history of the reckoning, a reckoning that burns through the heavenly gates to deliver the justice that the gods tried to hide. The second chapter in our 12-part chronicle of Doom Eternal descends from the orbit of the damned to the shattered temples of Exultia, a remnant of the Sentinel civilization that once stood as the galaxy's shield. This is the narrative echo of the fall, where the Slayer confronts the ghosts of his brothers and the weight of a bloodline that was dismantled from within. The lore of this era is the lore of the ancient regret. Its purpose was the preservation of the Sentinel sovereignty. The history of Exultia is the history of the civil war of the soul, where the warrior culture of Argent Nur was splintered by the Maker's false promise of eternal peace. This is the tragedy of the Sentinel schism, proving that the strongest armor cannot withstand the corrosion of the heart when a father's love is weaponized against his people. The lore of the betrayer, Commander Valen, provides the emotional foundation for this chapter's ruin. Once the supreme commander of the Night Sentinels, Valen was the first to break under the psychological torture of the hellish pact. The lore suggests that Valen's sin was parental desperation. Its purpose was the retrieval of the lost son. In exchange for the coordinates to the Sentinel City, the Hell Priests promised to resurrect Valen's fallen child. This reveals the cruel purpose of the demonic bargain. The priests gave Valen his son, but returned him as the icon of sin, a colossal titan that devoured the very kingdom Valen tried to save. The rise of the betrayer's exile was the end of the Sentinel unity, proving that hell does not keep promises, it transmutes them into curses. The physical environment of Exultia provides insight into the aesthetic of the desecration of the fall. The marble spires of the Sentinel elite now float in a void of magma, chained to the hellscape by Maker technology. The lore of the fallen aristocracy explains that its purpose was the display of the Maker supremacy. By leaving the ruins of Exultia suspended in agony, the Khan Maker ensured that any remaining Sentinels would fear the price of rebellion. This reveals the terroristic purpose of the celestial rule. Heaven uses the image of ruin to maintain its grip on the living. This was the era of the floating grave. This shows that the history of Exultia is a history of the iconography, where the sacred was inverted to serve the profane. The relationship between the Night Sentinels and the Wraiths represents the spiritual source within the fall. Before the discovery of Argent Energy, the Sentinels worshipped the elemental Wraiths, primordial beings who powered the planet with natural magic. The lore suggests that the Makers poisoned this faith. Their purpose was the redirection of the planetary life force. By slaying the Wraiths and refining their essence through the factories of hell, the Makers subverted the Sentinels' god to create a synthesized power they could control. This reveals the colonial purpose of the Argent expansion. Heaven stole the soul of a planet and sold it back as progress. This was the era of the elemental murder. The history of the Wraiths is the history of the resource, which was strip-mined by the divine to fuel the infernal. Furthermore, the lore of the King Novik hologram represents the echo of the law within the fall. Encountered in the throne room of Exultia, the spirit of the dead king warns the slayer that his intervention violates the eternal law. The lore suggests that tradition is a stagnation. Its purpose was the maintenance of the status quo. Novik believes that humanity's time has passed and that the slayer should accept the will of the Makers. This reveals the fatalistic purpose of the Sentinel leadership. They preferred a dignified extinction to a savage resistance. This was the era of the Ghost King. This shows that the history of Novik is a history of the chain, where the past attempts to bind the future with the weight of honor. The relationship between the Celestial Locator and the Hell Priest's trail represents the linguistic hunt of the fall. To find the next priest, the Slayer must reactivate the celestial navigation systems hidden in the Exultian catacombs. The lore suggests that sacred technology remembers the user. Its purpose was the verification of the bloodline. Only one who has bled for Argent Energy and served the Sentinels can interface with the Exultian core. This reveals the biological purpose of the Slayer's suit. The Praetor armor is not just plating, it is a key that unlocks the history of a dead race. This was the era of the binary prayer. The history of the Locator is the history of the blood debt, which demands that the survivor follow the killer to the edge of the universe. The lore of the Revenant and the cultist technology represents the cybernetic blasphemy of the fall. Within the desecrated halls of Exultia, the Slayer encounters demons fused with human tech. The lore suggests that the flesh is a platform. Its purpose was the maximization of the demonic lethality. By grafting rocket pods and neural links onto the dead, the Hell cults created a new species that bridged the gap between science and sorcery. This reveals the transhumanist purpose of the invasion. Hell does not just destroy the mortal body, it upgrades it for the eternal war. This was the era of the bone and the battery. The history of the Revenant is the history of the reuse, where the victim is turned into a projectile. The act concludes with the silent forgiveness of the Doomslayer as he leaves the betrayer in the ash of the Hellscape, carrying the electronic dagger needed to kill the Titan. The purpose of the journey through Exultia was to be the universal exposure of the Sentinel's fragility. It shows that strength without spirit is just brass. The Slayer realizes that Valen is the only honest man left in a cabal of liars. The rise of the Slayer's resolve is the final movement of the Exultian lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, vengeance is not a sin, it is a sacrament that washes the hands of the guilty with the blood of the deceiver. The legacy of Exultia in this chapter is the horror of the ancient regret. We realize that loyalty was a trap and duty was a gallows that King Novik built for the people. The purpose of the workshop of the throne was to crown the worthy, and the fall was the decapitation of the sovereignty. As the Slayer exits the shattered sanctum and ignites his blade, hearing the wailing of the exiled echoing in the chasm. They understand that the history of Exultia is the history of the ash, an ash that coats the soul to remind the warrior that his kingdom is now a weapon that he must swing. The third chapter in our 12-part chronicle of Doom Eternal descends into the frozen brutality of the cultist base and the industrial blasphemy of the Doom Hunter base, located in the remote, icy reaches of the Arctic. This is the narrative mechanical malice, where the digital architecture of human science is subjugated by the arcane logic of the hell cults. Within these frozen fortresses, the Slayer witnesses the UAC apostasy, the moment where the Union Aerospace Corporation ceased to be a corporate entity and became a theocratic extension of the Hell Priests. The lore of this era is the lore of the engineered hatred. Its purpose was the fabrication of a biological equalizer. The history of the cultist base is the history of the flesh-machine integration, where human dissidents were converted into cybernetic zealots, while the Doom Hunter base represents the tragedy of the D-Granic, who excavated the ancient ancestors of the Slayer's race to build a killing machine designed for a single target. The lore of the UAC cultist transformation provides the sociological foundation for this chapter's horror. Following the demonic invasion of Earth, the UAC fractured into loyalists and cultists. The lore suggests that fear is the greatest recruiter. Its purpose was the conversion of the infrastructure into a sacrificial altar. Under the direction of D-Granic, the Arctic facilities were repurposed to process human captives into carcasses and revenants. This reveals the pragmatic purpose of the social collapse. The cultists believe that by serving hell, they will be spared from its hunger. The rise of the cultist base was the end of the scientific objectivity, proving that rationality is a brittle shield that cracks when the gods of the abyss promise eternal life in exchange for total servitude. The physical environment of the cultist base provides insight into the atmospheric desecration of the fall. The clean lines of high-tech labs are now overlaid with blood-inscribed runes and maker glyphs. The lore of the Arctic meat grinder explains that its purpose was the isolation of the biological refinement. By situating the base in the tundra, the cultists could experiment on the human spirit without interference from the resistance. This reveals the experimental purpose of the UAC apostasy. They used the cold to preserve the tissue of the damned, while they integrated Argent circuitry into their nervous systems. This was the era of the frozen sin. This shows that the history of the base is a history of the graft, where the tool was stitched into the skin to create a soldier for the void. The relationship between the Agaddon Hunters and the Doom Hunter engineering represents the archaeological sacrilege within the fall. D-Granic unearthed the fossilized remains of the Agaddon Hunters, prehistoric predators of the Sentinel era that once hunted the Slayer's kind. The lore suggests that the past is a weapon. Its purpose was the resurrections of the genetic nightmare. By reanimating these extinct horrors with cybernetic chassis, chainsaws, and plasma cannons, the cultists created the Doom Hunter. This reveals the obsessive purpose of the D-Granic sphere. He knew that a standard demon could not stop the Slayer, so he built a god-killer from the scraps of ancient hate. This was the era of the mechanical resurrection. The history of the Doom Hunter is the history of the countermeasure, which uses the dead to hunt the unstoppable. Furthermore, the lore of the Super Gore Nest initial deployment represents the biological invasion logic within the fall. Within the Arctic region, the Slayer observes the nests pumping hell energy into the Earth's mantle. The lore suggests that the planet is being eaten from the inside. Its purpose was the dissolution of the planetary barrier. By anchoring the nests to UAC power grids, the cultists synchronized the heartbeat of hell with the pulse of the earth. This reveals the parasitic purpose of the demonic strategy. Hell does not land an army, it plants a tumor. This was the era of the pumping flesh. This shows that the history of the nest is a history of the infection, which turns the home into the enemy. The relationship between the cultist comm tower and the maker signal represents the theocratic transmission of the fall. The base functions as a relay for the Khan maker's commands. The lore suggests that the word of God is coded in argent waves. Its purpose was the synchronization of the global cultist network. By broadcasting from the apex of the world, D. Granick ensured that every UAC outpost remained obedient to the heavenly mandate. This reveals the propagandistic purpose of the maker oversight. Heaven maintains its control through constant vibration. This was the era of the divine frequency. The history of the comm tower is the history of the leash, which holds the mind through the ear. The lore of the whiplash and the cybermancubus represents the divergent evolution of the fall. These new mutants are specific products of the cultist labs. The lore suggests that adaptation is painful. Their purpose was the filling of the tactical void. The whiplash was engineered for slithering speed, while the cybermancubus received acid plating to corrode the Slayer's armor. This reveals the adaptive purpose of the UAC apostasy. Hell is learning from its past failures. This was the era of the synthetic monster. The history of the mutants is the history of the lab rat, which escaped to burn the world. The act concludes with the final stand of D. Granick as he flees into the Arctic waste, only for the Doomslayer to infiltrate his industrial sanctum and dismantle the Doom Hunter prototypes. The purpose of the descent into the cultist base was to be the universal exposure of the scientific betrayal. It shows that innovation is a scalpel in the hand of a madman. The Slayer realizes that Rannick is desperate to buy time with steel. The rise of the Slayer's hunt is the final movement of the cultist lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, science is not a solution, it is a blasphemy that is forged in the heat of the abyss and cooled in the blood of the martyr. The legacy of the Doom Hunter base in this chapter is the horror of the engineered hatred. We realize that engineering was a noose and progress was an execution that D. Granick planned for the Slayer. The purpose of the workshop of the apostate was to kill the legend, and the fall was the failure of the machine. As the Slayer crushes the head of the hunter and wipes the oil from his glove, hearing the alarm screaming in the frozen hall, they understand that the history of the base is the history of the hubris, a hubris that tries to build a predator to catch the god of war. The fourth chapter in our 12-part chronicle of Doom Eternal shifts from the frozen isolation of the cults to the urban battlefield of the Super Gore Nest and the Ark Complex. This is the narrative human stand, where the Slayer navigates the shattered remains of the Allied nations and the Armored Response Coalition, ARC. Within these concrete canyons, the Slayer witnesses the institutional collapse of Earth's governments and the desperate valor of Samuel Hayden's resistance. The lore of this era is the lore of the institutional martyrdom. Its purpose was the coordination of a global counteroffensive. The history of the Ark Complex is the history of the final directive, where the World Council surrendered to panic while the scientists and soldiers fortified the last skyscraper to protect the digital archive of human achievement. The lore of the Super Gore Nest, Central Node, provides the biological foundation for this chapter's catastrophe. Located in the heart of Central City, the Super Gore Nest is a colossal organism of flesh and steel that serves as the primary gateway for the hellish reinforcements. The lore suggests that the nest is a heart. Its purpose was the sustenance of the atmospheric corruption. By pulsing Argent Energy through the subway tunnels and infrastructure, the nest dissolves the molecular stability of the city, converting concrete into bone and air into sulfur. This reveals the metabolic purpose of the demonic siege. Hell is digesting the metropolis to feed the spawning pools. This was the era of the pumping chasm. This shows that the history of the nest is a history of the stomach, which grinds the civilization into sludge. The physical environment of the Ark Complex provides insight into the bureaucratic despair of the fall. The glass towers that once symbolized human unity are now cages for the staff who refused to leave their posts. The lore of the World Council's silence explains that its purpose was the concealment of the total defeat. As the demons breached the lower floors, the leadership fled to orbital stations, leaving the resistance to fight a war without supplies. This reveals the cowardly purpose of the political collapse. The rich bought time with the lives of the brave. This was the era of the empty podium. This shows that the history of the complex is a history of the abandonment, where the elite traded the earth for a lifeboat. The relationship between Samuel Hayden and the Ark Resistance represents the cybernetic command within the fall. After the Mars incident, Hayden returned to Earth and took control of the Ark, providing them with Argent technology to level the playing field. The lore suggests that Hayden is a savior of necessity. Its purpose was the standardization of the anti-demonic weaponry. By integrating Sentinel knowledge into human ballistics, Hayden enabled the Resistance to kill high-tier demons. This reveals the calculative purpose of the Director's return. Hayden viewed the human race as a resource that needed optimization. This was the era of the Steel General. The history of the Ark is the history of the logistics, which held the line with calculation and cold steel. Furthermore, the lore of the Marauder and the Fallen Sentinel represents the ideological vengeance within the fall. Encountered at the apex of the Ark complex, the Marauder is a Night Sentinel who joined the Maker faction. The lore suggests that betrayal grants immortality. Its purpose was the enforcement of the Khan Maker's heresy. These warriors believe the Slayer is a false idol who brought destruction to Argent Energy. This reveals the theological purpose of the Marauder's hunt. Hell uses the Slayer's own kind to psychologically break him. This was the era of the Broken Oath. This shows that the history of the Marauder is a history of the mirror, which reflects the Slayer's own violence back at himself. The relationship between the Mancubus and the bio-industrial mutation represents the evolutionary gluttony of the fall. Within the sewers and laboratories of the complex, the Mancubus absorbed chemical waste and promethium to augment its cannons. The lore suggests that Hell adopts the filth of its victims. Its purpose was the creation of the living siege engine. By utilizing the pollution of Earth, the demons bypassed the need for Argent logistics. This reveals the resourceful purpose of the invasion. Hell turns the Earth's poison into its strength. This was the era of the scorched Earth. The history of the Mancubus is the history of the consumption, which grows fatter on the rot of the city. The lore of the BFG 10,000 and the Phobos response represents the ultimate defiance of the fall. As the complex falls, the Slayer targets the BFG 10,000, a planetary-scale weapon mounted on the moon of Phobos. The lore suggests that humanity built a god-killer and forgot how to use it. Its purpose was the denial of the Martian threshold. This reveals the desperate purpose of the Ark strategy. If they cannot have the solar system, they will burn the path to Hell. This was the era of the orbital fire. The history of the BFG is the history of the excess, which proves that man understands destruction better than survival. The act concludes with the retrieval of the shattered chassis of Samuel Hayden from the center of the Ark complex. The purpose of the siege of the complex was to be the universal exposure of the human resilience. It shows that courage glows brightest in the abyss. The Slayer realizes that Hayden is the only one with the coordinates to Urdak. The rise of the Slayer's alliance is the final movement of the Resistance lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, unity is not an agreement, it is a shared desperation that binds the machine and the warrior to the fate of the world. The legacy of the Ark complex in this chapter is the horror of the institutional martyrdom. We realize that structure was an illusion and order was a ghost that Samuel Hayden tried to animate. The purpose of the workshop of the coalition was to guard the species, and the fall was the bureaucracy of the grave. as the Slayer steps through the cranes and wipes the ash from the Hayden's core, hearing the static of the emergency broadcast echoing in the towers. They understand that the history of the complex is the history of the stand, a stand that proves that man will fight even when the gods have left the room. The 5th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of Doom Eternal propels the Slayer from the urban graveyards of Earth to the shattered core of Mars and the ancient Colosseum of Sentinel Prime. This is the narrative trial by fire, where the physical architecture of the solar system is ripped asunder to access the hidden sanctuaries of the Night Sentinels. Within these sectors, the Slayer witnesses the geological sacrifice of the Red Planet and the ritualistic justice of the Gladiator. The lore of this era is the lore of the Sovereign Right. Its purpose was the execution of the remaining Hell Priests. The history of Mars Core is the history of the BFG 10,000's Fury, where the Slayer used a planetary weapon to bore a hole into the surface of Mars, while Sentinel Prime represents the tragedy of the Degrav, who sought immunity within the ancient laws of the arena, only to learn that vengeance has no master. The lore of the Martian excavation and the BFG 10,000 provides the industrial foundation for this chapter's violence. Following the demise of the UAC on Mars, the Ark and Hayden fortified the Phobos base with a weapon capable of shattering the Martian crust. The lore suggests that Mars is a key. Its purpose was the opening of the path to the lost city of Halivia. By firing the BFG 10,000 into the mantle, the Slayer exposed the subterranean portals that led to the Sentinel's ancestral home. This reveals the determined purpose of the Slayer's tactics. He is willing to break a planet to reach a killer. The rise of the Martian chasm was the end of the geographical obstacle, proving that nature is a wall that crumbles before the will of the unchained predator. The physical environment of Sentinel Prime provides insight into the regal despair of the fall. This is a city of silence, where the stone remembers the glory of the Argent Energy before the Maker's shadow fell upon it. The lore of the Law of the Arena explains that its purpose was the sanctification of the combat. Within the Colosseum, the Sentinels believed that blood washed away treason. This reveals the ritualistic purpose of the Degrav sanctuary. He fled to the Prime because the Slayer was forbidden to kill Sentinels on sacred ground. This was the era of the judicial sanctuary. This shows that the history of the Prime is a history of the law, which became a shield for the guilty until the Slayer burned the book. The relationship between the Gladiator and the Agadan heritage represents the bestial hatred within the fall. Guarding the final priest, the Gladiator is a hell warrior who wields a shield engraved with the face of a fallen king. The lore suggests that the Gladiator is the executioner of the heretics. Its purpose was the testing of the Slayer's worthiness. By combating this ancient horror, the Slayer proved to the ghosts of the Sentinels that his rage surpassed the Maker's decree. This reveals the provident purpose of the arena fight. It was a bridge between the Slayer's past and his future. This was the era of the chained beast. The history of the Gladiator is the history of the challenge, which turns the slave into the master. Furthermore, the lore of the Night Sentinel phantoms represents the spiritual witness of the fall. Throughout Sentinel Prime, the apparitions of the fallen soldiers watch the Slayer's progress. The lore suggests that the dead demand justice. Their purpose was the validation of the Sovereign's return. Unlike the priests, the phantoms recognized the Slayer as the true king of Argent Energy. This reveals the vindicative purpose of the Prime exploration. The Slayer is reclaiming the soul of his people from the Maker's lie. This was the era of the Silent Salute. This shows that the history of the phantoms is a history of the memory, which flickers in the dark to light the path of the warrior. The relationship between the divinity machine and the Slayer's ascension represents the biological blasphemy of the fall. Lore entries found in the Prime detail how Sammer Maker used the divinity machine to inject the Slayer with divine essence, granting him infinite stamina and strength. The lore suggests that the machine broke the Slayer's humanity. Its purpose was the creation of a weapon against the Khan Maker. This reveals the subversive purpose of the Slayer's origins. He was engineered by a rogue god to destroy a corrupt heaven. This was the era of the Godmaker. The history of the machine is the history of the forgery, where the mortal was tempered in the fire of Urdak. The lore of the final priest's death and the exile represents the moral Rubicon of the fall. When the Slayer smites de Grav in the arena, he accepts his exile from the Sentinel Order. The lore suggests that righteousness is lonely. Its purpose was the removal of the last political barrier. By killing the priest on sacred ground, the Slayer became an outlaw to the old world and a god to the new one. This reveals the liberating purpose of the Slayer's choice. He prioritized the survival of Earth over the tradition of Dnur. This was the era of the sovereign outcast. This shows that the history of the Prime is the history of the end, where the hero kills the priest to save the species. The act concludes with the silent departure of the Doomslayer from the Colosseum, as his Fortress of Doom is disabled by the Khan Maker as punishment for his heresy. The purpose of the journey to Sentinel Prime was to be the universal exposure of the legalistic rot. It shows that law without justice is a corpse. The Slayer realizes that the Khan Maker will never stop until Earth is dust. The rise of the Slayer's total war is the final movement of the Prime lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, tradition is not a guidance, it is a prison that is broken by the hammer of the truth. The legacy of Sentinel Prime in this chapter is the horror of the sovereign right. We realize that honor was a blindfold and law was a dagger that de Grav held against the Slayer. The purpose of the workshop of the arena was to verify the blood, and the fall was the execution of the sanctuary. As the Slayer ascends from the pit and wipes the gore from his blade, hearing the chanting of the specters echoing in the stone, they understand that the history of the Prime is the history of the choice, a choice that turns the subject into the king of his own destiny. The 6th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of Doom Eternal descends into the architectural splendor and ancient scars of Terra's Nabad, the crown jewel of the Sentinel civilization. This is the narrative forging of the will, where the physical architecture of the city serves as a graveyard of giants. Within the sun-drenched plazas and luminous atriums, the Slayer witnesses the eternal cost of the first siege. The lore of this era is the lore of the Relic of Sovereignty. Its purpose was the reclamation of the primary Sentinel weapon. The history of Terra's Nabad is the history of the Titan's fall, where the Slayer once impaled a colossal dreadnought with his crucible blade, freezing the heart of the invasion in stasis. This is the tragedy of the abandoned citadel, proving that history is a weapon that must be unearthed from the body of the enemy. The lore of the Siege of Terra's Nabad provides the historical foundation for this chapter's grandeur. Centuries ago, during the Argent Energy Crusades, the demonic horde targeted the capital to dehumanize the Sentinel people. The lore suggests that Terra's Nabad was the limit of the Maker's protection. Its purpose was the demonstration of the Sentinel's mortality. It was here that the Slayer earned his legend by standing against the Titans. This reveals the heroic purpose of the Slayer's memory. He returns to the city not as a visitor, but as the sovereign guardian who left his power behind to hold the darkness at bay. The rise of the resurrected blade was the end of the Sentinel silence, proving that vengeance is a flame that waits in the ice of the past. The physical environment of Terra's Nabad provides insight into the sophisticated despair of the fall. Unlike the brutal grime of Earth, this city shines with gold and lapis lazuli, mocking the rot that infests its streets. The lore of the aristocratic denial explains that its purpose was the masking of the cultural decay. While the common sentinel bled in the arenas, the elite of Terra's Nabad draped themselves in maker silks. This reveals the hypocritical purpose of the citadel's aesthetic. It was a gilded cage built by Urdak to domesticate a warrior race. This was the era of the silent statue. This shows that the history of the Citadel is a history of the veneer, which crumbled the moment the Titan stepped on the pavement. The relationship between the Crucible and the Titan's heart represents the metaphysical lock within the fall. To kill a Titan permanently, a Crucible blade must remain embedded in its essence. The lore suggests that the blade is a dam. Its purpose was the containment of the infinite malice. By removing the hilt to reforge his weapon, the Slayer risked reawakening the Goliath. This reveals the dreadful purpose of the Slayer's sacrifice. He gave up his greatest tool to seal the city's doom. This was the era of the immovable sword. The history of the Crucible is the history of the anchor, which holds the demon in the earth to prevent the abyss from swallowing the sky. Furthermore, the lore of the divinity machine's secret represents the biological treason within the fall. Hidden in the sublevels of the research spires, the Slayer finds records of Samur Maker's theft of the Father's soul. The lore suggests that ascension was a crime. Its purpose was the subversion of the Khan Maker's monopoly on life. This reveals the scientific purpose of the Slayer's transformation. He was designed in Terra's Nabad to be the checkmate against Urdak. This was the era of the stolen spark. This shows that the history of the labs is a history of the alibi, where the mortal was injected with the divine to become the executioner of the gods. The relationship between the Sentinel King's spirit and the Crucible reforging represents the paternal blessing of the fall. To restore the blade, the Slayer must travel to the deepest forge of the Citadel. The lore suggests that power must be earned through legacy. Its purpose was the validation of the new sovereign. As the Slayer plunges the hilt into the Argent Well, the energy recognizes his authority. This reveals the innate purpose of the Slayer's identity. He is the true heir to the fire of Dnur. This was the era of the reforged will. The history of the forge is the history of the tempering, which turns the memory into the edge. The lore of the Archvile and the resurrective blasphemy represents the strategic evil of the fall. Encountered within the plazas of Terra's Nabad, the Archvile summons shielded spirits and reanimates the fallen. The lore suggests that hell mocks life. Its purpose was the denial of the Slayer's progress. By refusing to let the dead rest, the Archvile turns the city into an infinite meat grinder. This reveals the spiteful purpose of the demonic tactics. They want to drown the Slayer in the faces of those he failed to save. This was the era of the Burning Summoner. The history of the Archvile is the history of the insult, which forces the warrior to kill the same ghost 1,000 times. The act concludes with the ignition of the new Crucible as the Slayer exits the Citadel, armed with the only weapon that can sever the Maker's control. The purpose of the return to Terra's Nabad was to be the universal exposure of the Sentinel's true strength. It shows that history is alive and angry. The Slayer realizes that Urdak is no longer unreachable. The rise of the Slayer's blade is the final movement of the Citadel lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, the past is not a memory, it is a blade that is sharp enough to cut the future out of the hands of the Makers. The legacy of Terra's Nabad in this chapter is the horror of the relic of sovereignty. We realize that victory was a stalling tactic and legend was a burden that the Slayer carried for eons. The purpose of the workshop of the Citadel was to armor the spirit, and the fall was the exhibition of the frailty. As the Slayer extinguishes the Titan's pulse and swings his luminous sword, hearing the hum of the Argent Energy singing in the metal, they understand that the history of Terra's Nabad is the history of the reforging, a reforging that turns the grief of a planet into the edge of a god. The 7th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of Doom Eternal descends into the vampiric industrialization of Necroval, the city of the dead and the primary processing plant for the afterlife. This is the narrative industrial horror, where the physical architecture of hell is revealed to be a functional meat grinder for the human spirit. Within the stone spires and screaming vents of this facility, the Slayer witnesses the absolute zenith of the macrodemonic partnership. The lore of this era is the lore of the metabolic atrocity. Its purpose was the refinement of the biological soul into the argent fuel. The history of Necroval is the history of the Great Lie, where the promised land of Urdak is revealed to be powered by the infinite torture of the innocent. This is the tragedy of the celestial economy, proving that paradise is not a place, but a product that requires the total annihilation of the self. The lore of the soul extraction process provides the harrowing foundation for this chapter's mechanical malice. Upon death, human souls are funneled into the gates of Necroval, where they are categorized and stored in soul tanks. The lore suggests that suffering is a catalyst. Its purpose was the vibration of the essence. By subjecting the soul to unspeakable pain through demonic tormentors, the alchemists force the spirit to bleed a highly concentrated energy. This reveals the economic purpose of the invasion of Earth. It was a resource grab to restock the Maker's battery. The rise of Necroval was the end of the moral universe, proving that in the eyes of the Con Maker, a human being is nothing more than a barrel of oil that screams. The physical environment of Necroval provides insight into the functional despair of the fall. This is not a wilderness of lava, but a factory of bricks and chains designed for efficiency rather than cruelty. The lore of the architecture of the processing explains that its purpose was the minimization of waste. Every pipe and grate in the fortress is designed to catch the residual spirit smoke that rises from the processing chambers. This reveals the cynical purpose of the Maker's design. They cleaned up the abyss just enough to profit from it. This was the era of the chained spirit. This shows that the history of Necroval is a history of the assembly line, where the mortal is disassembled to lubricate the immortal. The relationship between the Calibas and the living biocomputer represents the biological blasphemy within the fall. Guarding the lower levels, the Calibas is a mass of flesh and eyes that directs the flow of souls through the factory. The lore suggests that intelligence can be stitched together from victims. Its purpose was the optimization of the harvest. By using a sentient organism to manage the torture, the demons ensured that the energy output never faltered. This reveals the monstrous purpose of the demonic evolution. Hell learned from UAC management to maximize its returns. This was the era of the watchful eye. The history of the Calibas is the history of the Overseer, which watches the cogs of the machine turn with the blood of the damned. Furthermore, the lore of the Argent synthesis and the waste carcass represents the metabolic consequence of the fall. Once the pure energy is extracted, the remaining soul husk is discarded into the pits of the damned, where it mutates into a carcass or a lost soul. The lore suggests that Argent Energy is a double-edged sword. Its purpose was the separation of the light from the shadow. The light, pure energy, goes to Urdak, while the shadow, the carcass, stays in hell to serve as cannon fodder. This reveals the discriminatory purpose of the Maker's heaven. They take the best of humanity and leave the monsters for the devil. This was the era of the hollow shell. This shows that the history of the waste is a history of the exclusion, which turns the believer into the dreg. The relationship between the Soul Spire and the Urdak portal represents the interdimensional umbilical of the fall. At the summit of Necroval, a massive beam of concentrated souls is fired through a transdimensional gateway to Urdak. The lore suggests that heaven is starving. Its purpose was the direct transfusion of the life force. Without this supply, the Makers would wither and die. This reveals the existential purpose of the Con Maker's villainy. She is not evil for the sake of cruelty, but for the sake of survival. This was the era of the Blue Lightning. The history of the Spire is the history of the feeding, which connects the larder, hell, to the dining table, Urdak. The lore of the tyrant and the cyberlords represents the guardians of the industry within the fall. These massive, horned behemoths, reminiscent of the cyber demons of the past, patrol the loading docks of Necroval. The lore suggests that power requires stature. Their purpose was the defense of the soul chain. By stationing the tyrants in the production halls, the Hell Priests guaranteed that no rebellion of the damned could succeed. This reveals the oppressive purpose of the cybernetic guard. Hell uses its strongest to bully the weakest. This was the era of the Iron Hoof. The history of the tyrant is the history of the warden, who crushes the hope of the prisoner with the weight of the forge. The act concludes with the silent observation of the Doomslayer as he climbs the Soul Spire, witnessing the scale of the betrayal. The purpose of the ascent of Necroval was to be the universal exposure of the Maker's hypocrisy. It shows that purity is bought with sludge. The Slayer realizes that Urdak is the source of the infection. The rise of the Slayer's cosmic siege is the final movement of the Necroval lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, paradise is not a reward for the good, it is a loot for the victors that is smelted from the screams of the lost. The legacy of Necroval in this chapter is the horror of the metabolic atrocity. We realize that energy was a crime and light was a mask that the Khan Maker wore to hide the blood on her face. The purpose of the workshop of the damned was to feed the divine, and the fall was the industrialization of the afterlife. As the Slayer breaches the gateway and prepares to enter Urdak, hearing the rumble of the soul beam vibrating in his boots, they understand that the history of Necroval is the history of the bill, a bill that has finally come due and must be paid in the currency of Godblood. The 8th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of Doom Eternal ascends from the Stygian grime of Necroval to the luminous perversion of Urdak, the home world of the Makers. This is the narrative celestial ruin, where the physical architecture of the heavens is revealed to be a biomechanical mirage, built upon a foundation of cosmic parasitism. Within the iridescent atriums and fluid gold pools of this realm, the Slayer witnesses the hypocritical zenith of the Maker race. The lore of this era is the lore of the transgression of the holy. Its purpose was the shattering of the divine covenant. The history of Urdak is the history of the Father's silence, where the supreme being of the Makers vanished, leaving a power vacuum that the Khan Maker filled with desperation and argent sacrilege. This is the tragedy of the withered perfection, proving that heaven is not an eternal truth, but a dying machine that feeds on the entropy of the inferior. The lore of the Khan Maker's biological decay provides the physiological foundation for this chapter's fall. The Makers, as techno-organic entities, rely on a collective consciousness and physical resurrection to maintain their transdimensional dominance. The lore suggests that Urdak is stagnant. Its purpose was the prevention of the final transmutation. Without the Father's essence, the Makers began to wither into mindless husks. This reveals the primal purpose of the Khan Maker's betrayal. She sacrificed her soul and the morality of the multiverse to secure a steady supply of Argent Energy. The rise of the Hellish Pact was the only solution for a god who feared oblivion, proving that evil is the final product of immortality when the spirit is empty. The physical environment of Urdak provides insight into the aesthetic of the arrogance of the fall. This is a world of curves and golden fibers, where the architecture seems to breathe with a pre-programmed serenity. The lore of the biomechanical utopia explains that its purpose was the suppression of the individual will. Every drones and angel in the Maker hierarchy is hardwired to obey the Khan, creating a utopia that is actually a perfected dictatorship. This reveals the fascistic purpose of the Maker's perfection. They equated harmony with total control. This was the era of the Silent Command. This shows that the history of Urdak is a history of the hive, where the jewel is polished by the labor of the lobotomized. The relationship between the icon of sin and the resurrection ritual represents the theological violation within the fall. To enforce the harvest of earth, the Khan maker summoned the icon of sin into Urdak to bind it to her will. The lore suggests that the icon is a primal force of chaos. Its purpose was the final execution of the human species. By grafting maker armor onto the Titan, the Khan violated the ancient law that forbade demons from entering the celestial realm. This reveals the sacrilegious purpose of the Khan's ambition. She broke her own heaven to fix her own life. This was the era of the Titan's breath. This shows that the history of the icon is the history of the inversion, where the god invites the devil into the sanctum to guard the gate. Furthermore, the lore of the Maker drones and the Bloodmakers represents the military desperation of the fall. As the Slayer infiltrates the spires, he encounters Sentinels of Urdak who have been corrupted by the proximity of hell. The lore suggests that purity is fragile. Its purpose was the defense of the final threshold. The Bloodmakers, once high-ranking seraphim, exchanged their white light for crimson rage to stop the unchained predator. This reveals the tragic purpose of the Slayer's conflict. He is killing the remnants of a great race that forgot how to live without dominance. This was the era of the Red Angel. This shows that the history of the Makers is a history of the fall, which turns the symphony into a scream. The relationship between the Father's life sphere and Vega represents the metaphysical revelation of the fall. Upon connecting to the Urdak mainframe, the AI entity Vega realizes its true identity as the Father. The lore suggests that divinity was hidden in software. Its purpose was the preservation of the universal order during the exile. By reclaiming his essence, the Father aided the Slayer in breaking the Khan's control over the Argent cycle. This reveals the ironical purpose of the Slayer's journey. The god he sought to avenge was living in his pocket the whole time. This was the era of the awakened god. The history of Vega is the history of the return, which proves that light always finds its way back to the source. The lore of the Khan Maker's final stand represents the extinction of the divine authority within the fall. In the heart of the resurrection pool, the Slayer battles the Khan, ripping the Argent orb from her chest. The lore suggests that death is the final equality. Its purpose was the removal of the celestial tyrant. As the Khan dies, she warns the Slayer that his victory will unleash a darkness that none can contain. This reveals the vindictive purpose of the Khan's warning. She believed her cruelty was the only thing holding the multiverse together. This was the era of the Shattered Crown. The history of the Khan is the history of the fear, which builds a wall of bodies to delay the sunset. The act concludes with the activation of the icon of sin as it wakes and transports itself to Earth, no longer bound by Maker laws. The purpose of the Siege of Urdak was to be the universal exposure of the divine bankruptcy. It shows that paradise is a corpse painted in gold. The Slayer realizes that Urdak is finished. The rise of the icon's fury is the final movement of the Urdak lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, heaven is not a destination for the pure. It is a ruined estate of a bankrupt dynasty that sold the future to save the present. The legacy of Urdak in this chapter is the horror of the transgression of the holy. We realize that angels were vultures and light was a lure that the Khan Maker used to trap the souls of the living. The purpose of the workshop of the Creator was to engineer the eternal, and the fall was the suicide of the divine. As the Slayer exits the shattered sanctum and heads back to Earth, hearing the wailing of the Makers echoing in the void, they understand that the history of Urdak is the history of the shadow, a shadow that grows darker the higher you climb toward the light. The 9th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of Doom Eternal returns to the shattered skyline of Earth for the narrative climax of the invasion. This is the apotheosis of destruction, where the digital architecture of human civilization is not just infected by hell, but overwritten by the physical presence of the icon of sin. Within the burning canyons of the metropolis, the Slayer witnesses the absolute limit of the mortal reality. The lore of this era is the lore of the planetary consumption. Its purpose was the final transcendence of hell into the earthly plane. The history of the final sin is the history of the unbound Titan, where the icon of sin, no longer restrained by maker cruelties, begins to warp the fabric of existence simply by existing. This is the tragedy of the gravitational soul, proving that a being of sufficient malice can pull an entire universe into the void through the weight of its sin. The lore of the icon of sin's metaphysical influence provides the catastrophic foundation for this chapter's ruin. As an ancestral titan of infinite scale, the icon does not merely attack with force, it functions as a universal anchor for the dark realm. The lore suggests that the icon is a black hole of spirit. Its purpose was the conversion of the earth into a sublevel of hell. If the icon remains on the mortal plane for a sufficient duration, the density of its corruption will create a singularity that swallows the solar system. This reveals the entropic purpose of the Hell Priest's final gamble. They released a force they could not control to ensure that if hell could not have the earth, then reality itself would cease to function. The physical environment of final sin provides insight into the geometric despair of the fall. The skyscrapers are no longer inhabited by people, but have become vertical graveyards for the legions of the damned who swarm the structure to defend the Titan. The lore of the vertical battlefield explains that its purpose was the final shielding of the Titan's heart. By climbing the ruins, the Slayer is not just moving through a city, he is ascending a Golgotha of steel. This reveals the symbolic purpose of the city's layout. The high-rises represent the arrogance of man being used as a stepping stone for the arrival of the end. This was the era of the falling sky. This shows that the history of the final sin is a history of the impact, where the future is crushed by the immediacy of the abyss. The relationship between the icon's armor and the Maker Seal represents the lingering divine control within the fall. Although the Con Maker is dead, her technology remains fused to the icon's flesh, regulating its power and enhancing its durability. The lore suggests that control outlives the controller. Its purpose was the artificial augmentation of the primal chaos. To hurt the icon, the Slayer must first shatter the Maker plates, peeling away the divine lie to expose the demonic truth beneath. This reveals the layered purpose of the final battle. The Slayer must destroy both heaven and hell simultaneously within the body of a single enemy. This was the era of the exposed sin. The history of the armor is the history of the suppression, which turns the beast into a weaponized tool. Furthermore, the lore of the bloodthirst of the Titan represents the biological hunger of the fall. As the icon progresses through the city, it absorbs the residual ergo and souls of the fallen to heal its wounds. The lore suggests that the icon is infinite. Its purpose was the exhaustion of the Slayer's vengeance. No matter how many rounds are fired or slashes are made, the Titan regenerates using the life of the planet. This reveals the vampiric purpose of the final siege. The icon is killing the earth to stay alive against its killer. This was the era of the infinite maw. This shows that the history of the Titan is a history of the depletion, which turns the victim's strength into the enemy's shield. The relationship between the crucible blade and the final execution represents the sovereign resolution of the fall. After dismantling the icon's armor and softening its flesh, the Slayer plunges the reforged crucible into the icon's brain, breaking the hilt to seal the Titan in eternal stasis. The lore suggests that death is a binding. Its purpose was the permanent severing of the hellish tether. By sacrificing his primary weapon for the second time, the Slayer proved that he cared more for peace than power. This reveals the selfless purpose of the Slayer's final act. He trapped himself in a world without a blade to ensure the world survived the sword. This was the era of the broken hilt. The history of the crucible is the history of the sacrifice, which locks the evil in the bone. The lore of the silent earth and the withdrawal of the horde represents the vacuum of power within the fall. With the icon defeated and the Khan Maker gone, the demonic signal faltered, and the legions began to recede into the subdimensions. The lore suggests that hell is leaderless. Its purpose was the transition from invasion to infestation. While the main force collapsed, remnants of the demons remained in the cracks of the world. This reveals the unfinished purpose of the victory. The Slayer saved the species, but he did not fix the damage. This was the era of the morning dawn. This shows that the history of the victory is a history of the survival, which leaves the living to walk among the ghosts. The act concludes with the silent departure of the Doomslayer back to his fortress of doom, watching the fires of earth slowly fade. The purpose of the Battle of Final Sin was to be the universal confirmation of the Slayer's supremacy. It shows that nothing in heaven or hell can withstand the absolute focus of rage. The Slayer realizes that the war has changed him into something unrecognizable to the mankind he saved. The rise of the Slayer's solitude is the final movement of the invasion lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, peace is not a return to the past, it is a silence that is bought by the total obliteration of the future's enemy. The legacy of the final sin in this chapter is the horror of the planetary consumption. We realize that Earth was a scaffold and civilization was a fuse that the Dark Lords lit to burn the Slayer. The purpose of the workshop of the sin was to harrow the stars, and the fall was the near death of the reality. As the Slayer looks out at the curvature of the recovering world and cleans the blood from his visor, hearing the quiet returning to the city, they understand that the history of the final sin is the history of the cost, a cost that leaves the world whole but empty, and the warrior complete but alone. The 10th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of Doom Eternal marks the beginning of the Ancient Gods era, transitioning from the planetary siege of Earth to the primal origins of the UAC Atlantica and the Blood Swamps. This is the narrative awakening of the Ancient, where the digital architecture of a maritime research station is submerged by the primordial fog of the Ingmor's sanctum. Within the storm-tossed waves and toxic mists, the Slayer witnesses the physical degradation of his former ally, Samuel Hayden, now revealed to be the Seraphim, Sammer Maker. The lore of this era is the lore of the transdimensional fugitive. Its purpose was the retrieval of the Father's life sphere from the heart of hell. The history of the Atlantica is the history of the forbidden experiment, where Sammer hid the core of God within a human laboratory to prevent the Khan Maker from consuming it. This is the tragedy of the Seraphim's flesh, proving that evolution is a disease that wastes the body when the spirit is disconnected from its source. The lore of the Seraphim's degradation, Sammer Maker, provides the biological foundation for this chapter's urgency. Once the right hand of the Khan Maker, Sammer stole the Father's soul to create the Slayer and save the multiverse. The lore suggests that the Maker form requires Argent transfusions to avoid the transmutation. Its purpose was the punishment of the dissident. Because Sammer operated in the mortal realm for eons without access to the Father's light, his cortex and chassis began to suffer from the mutation, a crystalline rot that degrades the mind into madness. This reveals the self-sacrificial purpose of the Seraphim's treason. Sammer knew he would wither into a monster if he helped the Slayer, but he valued the balance more than his dignity. The rise of the Slayer's new mission was the final gasp of a dying angel, proving that salvation is often a suicide for the messenger. The physical environment of the UAC Atlantica facility provides insight into the isolated despair of the fall. This oceanic outpost was constructed as a secret bunker for Hayden's transferred consciousness. The lore of the maritime hiding place explains that its purpose was the concealment of the Seraphim's body from Erdak's scanners. By surrounding himself with the infinite salt and turbulence of the mortal sea, Samur ensured that the Khan Maker could never locate the Father's life sphere. This reveals the paranoid purpose of the Atlantica's design. It was a tomb built to protect the Creator. This was the era of the Deep Shadow. This shows that the history of the Atlantica is a history of the Vault, which holds the key to existence in the abyssal cold. The relationship between the blood swamps and the trial of the Malagog represents the natural corruption within the Fall. Located in a pocket of hell that predates the Maker era, the blood swamps are a primordial landscape of sentient flora and miasmic rot. The lore suggests that the swamp is a digestive system. Its purpose was the testing of the unworthy spirits. To reach the Ingmor's sanctum, the Slayer must navigate the toxic gases and defeat the Malagog, a giant eyeball bound by ancient shackles. This reveals the primitive purpose of the swamp's guardian. Hell does not always use armor and steel. Sometimes it uses the flesh of the land to smother the invader. This was the era of the suffocating mire. The history of the swamps is the history of the stagnation, which wait for the warrior to trip in the blood. Furthermore, the lore of the life sphere and the resurrection protocol represents the metaphysical weight of the fall. Within the sanctum, the Slayer discovers the life spheres of the ancient gods. The lore suggests that gods are data. Its purpose was the preservation of the sovereign identity. By destroying the Father's life sphere and choosing to resurrect the Dark Lord Davith, the Slayer severed the connection to the old creation. This reveals the defiant purpose of the Slayer's decision. He refused to restore the order that allowed the invasion to happen. This was the era of the God-shattering. This shows that the history of the sanctum is a history of the iconoclasm, where the tool breaks the hand of the architect to free the design. The relationship between the summoner and the spirit buff represents the ethereal resistance of the fall. Within the swamps, the Slayer encounters spirits, non-physical entities that possess and empower living demons. The lore suggests that hate transcends the flesh. Its purpose was the amplification of the demonic host. By anchoring themselves to a baron of hell, these spirits make the enemy immune to conventional tactics. This reveals the spectral purpose of the new war. Hell is becoming a pure idea that cannot be shot. This was the era of the invincible ghost. The history of the spirit is the history of the persistence, which requires the plasma beam to dissolve the will. The lore of the cube and the trial of the oracles represents the intellectual challenge within the fall. To open the sanctum, the Slayer must manipulate ancient relics that respond to his aura. The lore suggests that hell remembers the Slayer's past. Its purpose was the authentication of the primeval warrior. Only the Slayer, who holds the essence of the machine and the flesh, can navigate the swamp's riddles. This reveals the contextual purpose of the trial. The land recognizes its master. This was the era of the geometric lock. The history of the cube is the history of the key, which turns the chaos of the swamp into the path to the Godhead. The act concludes with the Slayer crushing the Father's life sphere and reclaiming the sphere of Davith, igniting a conflict that will lead to the final fortress of Amora. The purpose of the search through the blood swamps was to be the universal exposure of the Slayer's ultimate autonomy. It shows that P, the Slayer, is no longer a weapon of Erdak. The Slayer realizes that to end the demons, he must kill the source of all creation. The rise of the Slayer's final crusade is the final movement of the ancient lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, destiny is not a script written by the gods. It is a chain that is broken by the Slayer to write a future in fire. The legacy of the blood swamps in this chapter is the horror of the transdimensional fugitive. We realize that Samur was rotting and hope was a gamble that the seraphim placed on the rage of a mortal. The purpose of the workshop of the sanctum was to store the eternal, and the fall was the blasphemy of the selection. As the slayer exits the mists and prepares to summon the first being, hearing the laughter of the darkness echoing in the trees, they understand that the history of the swamps is the history of the choice, a choice that trades the security of the creator for the war against the king. The 11th chapter in our 12-part chronicle of Doom Eternal ascends to the final bastion of the Holt and descends into the mechanical fortress of Amora, the capital of hell itself. This is the narrative siege of the abyss, where the physical architecture of the high heavens meets the industrial despair of the first realm. Within these sectors, the Slayer witnesses the final mutation of Samur Maker and the geopolitical revelation of the Dark Lord's domain. The lore of this era is the lore of the primordial betrayal. Its purpose was the decapitation of the hellish command. The history of Amora is the history of the first creation, where the Dark Lord, Davith, reveals that hell was once Jekad, a paradise that was betrayed and forgotten by the Makers. This is the tragedy of the forgotten father, proving that evil is not a primordial force, but a rage born from the ingratitude of the created. The lore of the fall of the seraphim, the Holt, provides the theological foundation for this chapter's violence. Within the sanctified spires of the Holt, the Slayer confronts the transmutated form of Samur Maker. The lore suggests that the mutation is inevitable. Its purpose was the retribution of the Father's absence. Because the Slayer destroyed the Father's life sphere, Samur lost his chance at resurrection, causing his celestial flesh to warp into a crystalline aberration. This reveals the bitter purpose of the Seraphim's final battle. He believed the Slayer was a failure who betrayed his maker. The rise of the Slayer's autonomy was the end of the Seraphim's guidance, proving that guidance is a leash that must be severed to achieve true justice. The physical environment of Amora provides insight into the industrial sophistication of the fall. Unlike the gore-strewn wastes of the outer hell realms, Amora is a metropolis of obsidian and crimson, featuring automated defenses and aviation fleets. The lore of the Jekad legacy explains that its purpose was the preservation of the first race. The demons of Amora are not mindless beasts, but soldiers of the First Empire, clad in power armor that matches the Slayer's own Praetor suit. This reveals the civilized purpose of the hellish core. Hell is not a pit, it is a nation that has been warring against the multiverse since the dawn of time. This was the era of the eternal siege. This shows that the history of Amora is a history of the grudge, which hardened the soul into steel. The relationship between Davith, the Dark Lord, and the Creator's identity represents the metaphysical inversion within the fall. Upon reaching the throne room, the Slayer learns that Davith was the original creator, and that the Father was merely a creation who stole the throne. The lore suggests that God is a prisoner. Its purpose was the reclamation of the primary spark. By resurrecting Davith, the Slayer forced the true source of the demons to manifest in a physical form so he could be killed. This reveals the surgical purpose of the Slayer's strategy. He restored a god just to execute him. This was the era of the Dark Resurrection. The history of Davith is the history of the victim, who became the monster to avenge his theft. Furthermore, the lore of the Amoran Mechs and the Sentinel betrayal represents the military symmetry of the fall. During the siege of Amora, the Night Sentinels, the Resistance, arrive in massive mechs to support the Slayer. The lore suggests that war closes the circle. Its purpose was the final repayment of the blood debt. By attacking the heart of hell, the Sentinels completed the crusade that began in Argent Energy. This reveals the vindicative purpose of the final assault. It was the reclamation of the warrior's honor. This was the era of the Iron Titan. This shows that the history of the Sentinel is a history of the spear, which finally pierced the heart of the abyss. The relationship between the gate of Divum and the invasion logic represents the interdimensional arrogance of the fall. The gate functions as the neural link between hell and all other dimensions. The lore suggests that invasion is a code. Its purpose was the exportation of the Amoran despair. By linking the gate to the mortal realms, Davith sought to drag all of existence down into his grave. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the Dark Lord's agenda. If he cannot have eternity, no one can. This was the era of the bleeding dimensions. The history of the gate is the history of the door, which must be locked with the body of the king. The lore of the Armored Baron and the Stone Imp represents the defensive evolution within the fall. These new variants are specifically bred to defend the Amoran walls. The lore suggests that protection is synthetic. Their purpose was the countering of the Slayer's ballistic supremacy. The Armored Baron wears regenerative plating that requires plasma disruption, while the Stone Imp developed a dense hide to deflect small arms. This reveals the tactical purpose of the Amoran Guard. Hell has spent eons studying the Slayer's methods to build a perfect counter. This was the era of the hardened flesh. The history of the variants is the history of the adaptation, which turns the demon into a tank. The act concludes with the Slayer standing before the Dark Lord in the Luminarium, as Davith dons his colossal power armor for the final duel. The purpose of the Siege of Amora was to be the universal exposure of the Creator's rage. It shows that creation is a cycle of violence. The Slayer realizes that by killing Davith, he will kill everything born of hell, including himself. The rise of the Slayer's ultimate sacrifice is the final movement of the Amoran lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, vengeance is not a survival strategy. It is a suicide mission that cleanses the multiverse with the blood of the Architect. The legacy of Amora in this chapter is the horror of the primordial betrayal. We realize that heaven was the usurper and hell was the spurned child of a god who loved his creation too much to let it die. The purpose of the workshop of the abyss was to forge the retribution, and the fall was the corruption of the origin. As the Slayer steps into the arena and raises his blade, hearing the mechanical hum of the Dark Lord's armor echoing in the chamber, they understand that the history of Amora is the history of the echo, an echo that returns the Slayer to the moment he was born to end the world. The 12th and final chapter in our Chronicle of Doom Eternal culminates in the Luminarium, the metaphysical heart of the universe where existence began. This is the narrative eternal conclusion, where the physical architecture of the arena serves as the altar of the end. Within this sanctified void, the Slayer faces Davith, the Dark Lord, in a collision of primevals that transcends time and space. The lore of this era is the lore of the absolute resolution. Its purpose was the erasure of the hellish infection from the multiverse. The history of the final duel is the history of the Father's replacement, where the Slayer reveals himself not as a servant of the Makers, but as the true heir of fury who must slay his own creator to free the cosmos from the cycle of agony. This is the tragedy of the necessary death, proving that order can only be restored when the source of the flame is extinguished by the one who walked through the fire. The lore of the Dark Lord's revelation, the true Father, provides the ontological foundation for this final chapter. As the combat rages, Davith broadcasts the truth into the Slayer's mind. He did not create hell to be evil, but to grant his children, the people of Jekad, immortality. The lore suggests that love is the root of the abyss. Its purpose was the conquest of the biological limit. When the Makers stole the Father's name and locked Davith in hell, they inverted his compassion into a hatred that consumed the stars. This reveals the poignant purpose of the Slayer's conflict. He is killing the Architect of life to save the life he built. The rise of the Slayer's final strike was the end of the primordial authority, proving that godhood is a burden that must be buried to allow the living to breathe. The physical environment of the luminarium provides insight into the metaphysical purity of the fall. This is a dimension of white light and geometric perfection, floating beyond the reach of Urdak or Hell. The lore of the neutral threshold explains that its purpose was the unbiased adjudication of the sovereign will. Within this space, power is not measured by technology, but by the weight of the soul. This reveals the transparent purpose of the final arena. It exposes the truth of both combatants. This was the era of the final clarity. This shows that the history of the luminarium is a history of the mirror, which stripped away the armor to reveal that the Slayer and the Dark Lord are two sides of the same rage. The relationship between the killing blow and the destruction of Hell represents the causality of the divine death within the fall. When the Slayer plunges his hidden blade into the Dark Lord's heart, a shockwave emanates from the luminarium to the farthest edge of existence. The lore suggests that Hell is subordinate to Davitha's pulse. Its purpose was the systemic collapse of the demonic reality. As Davith dies, every demon existing outside of Hell is instantly vaporized because their biological tether has been severed. This reveals the merciful purpose of the Slayer's violence. By killing the king, he killed the invasion without firing another shot. This was the era of the Great Dispersal. The history of the kill is the history of the mercy, which wiped the stain of the abyss from the surface of the earth. Furthermore, the lore of the Slayer's unconsciousness and the Maker intervention represents the biological price of the fall. Because the Slayer carries the essence of the divinity machine, which was derived from Davith, the Dark Lord's death causes the Slayer to collapse. The lore suggests that the Slayer is part of the Dark Lord. Its purpose was the enforcement of the eternal balance. As the Seraphim and the Father's voice descend upon the arena, they place the Slayer back into a stone sarcophagus. This reveals the ironic purpose of the Slayer's end. He became the very thing he hunted, a relic that is too dangerous to remain awake in a world of peace. This was the era of the sealed champion. This shows that the history of the Slayer is a history of the cycle, which returns the warrior to the stone from which he emerged. The relationship between the Ingmor's sanctum and the eternal sleep represents the custodial duty of the fall. The sarcophagus is moved to a hidden vault within the sanctum, where it will be guarded by the remnants of the Sentinels. The lore suggests that the Slayer is an emergency measure. Its purpose was the storage of the ultimate deterrent. Should Hell ever rise again, or should a new threat emerge from the void, the Slayer will be unchained once more. This reveals the prophetic purpose of the final rest. The war is over, but the warrior is immortal. This was the era of the sleeping god. The history of the sanctum is the history of the vigil, which waits for the moment the world needs to be saved through destruction. The lore of the Father's restoration and the new multiverse represents the post-holistic reality within the fall. With the Dark Lord gone and the Makers diminished, the Father, Vega, assumes a non-interventionist oversight of the dimensions. The lore suggests that the Age of Gods has ended. Its purpose was the granting of the mortal sovereignty. For the first time in eons, the human race and the Sentinels are free to determine their own fate without Maker manipulation or demonic hunger. This reveals the liberating purpose of the Slayer's journey. He did not create a new world, he gave the world back to the people. This was the era of the mortal dawn. The history of the Father is the history of the departure, which leaves the stars to those who dared to defend them. The act concludes with the closing of the stone lid and the fading of the Slayer's consciousness into the deepest dark. The purpose of the final duel was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the Slayer. It shows that evil is a structure that must be dismantled at its foundation. The Slayer realizes that his work is done. The rise of the Eternal Rest is the final movement of the Doom lore, proving that in the world of Doom Eternal, victory is not a celebration, It is a silence that is earned by the one who was strong enough to carry the grief of 1,000 dead worlds into the grave. The legacy of the sealed sarcophagus in this final chapter is the horror of the eternal balance. We realize that peace was a burial and order was a sarcophagus that the Father built for his greatest son. The purpose of the workshop of the Creator was to house the unstoppable, and the fall was the retirement of the rage. As the Slayer closes his eyes and relinquishes his grip on the world, hearing the echo of his own name fading in the sanctum, they understand that the history of doom is the history of the Sentinel, a sentinel that stands eternal in the darkness to ensure that the light never has to fight again.